take this in three parts. We do a little origins of Yawkey there early. We'll do the black-white stuff now, and then we'll come back and do 67 and 76. Bill Nowlin, of course, the great book on Yawkey. We all know the controversy right now in Boston about Jersey Street, renaming it. It was renamed the Yawkey Way, then taking it back to Jersey Street. It's complicated, the 50s here, with the Red Sox being the last team to integrate with Pumpsie Green in 59. Bill, you did a lot of work on this. You know, Jackie Robinson and Willie Mays had tryouts. Robinson had one in 45. There was bad language. A lot of people thought it was Yawkey who said it. No evidence to say that was the case. But here's the bottom line. You know, he was the last team by a long shot to bring in a black player, yet there's not a lot of evidence in his life that he was a racist or a bigot. So it's a very tricky call of what occurred here as far as why the Red Sox took forever to get some black African Americans on their ball club. Bill, you spent months writing this book. What'd you find out here? What can you tell me?
Well, I was born in 1945, so I was 14 years old when the Red Sox integrated with Pumpsie Green, and I can remember being 12 and 13 and being confused and embarrassed. You know, how come my team is, you know, here's Boston where the abolitionist movement began. There's all these civil rights movement active in the South, and the Red Sox have an all-white team. And you could just look at the great black athletes from two of them you mentioned, both MVPs, Jackie Robinson, Willie Mays, and the Red Sox couldn't find a single black player. You know, what's the story here? A lot of people, Jackie Robinson, one time, he never met Yawkey, as far as I know, but he looked at Yawkey's actions or inactions, and in like 67, when the Red Sox were up for, you know, in the World Series, he said he hoped the Red Sox won because he thought that Yawkey was one of the most racist men in baseball.
Yeah, lost. Yeah, Red Sox lost, yes.
Would lose, yes. Yeah, sorry. So he had no love for Yawkey, even though they never met. I think what his statement was, in the action or inaction, the Red Sox, maybe Yawkey wasn't personally racist, but the team never integrated, and he owned 100% of it. He didn't report to some investment group. He was the owner. Any one day that he wanted to change things, he could have, and he didn't. So I was looking for a smoking gun. I was trying to find it, asking everybody I could talk to, even people that were just fans that went to Braves Field and saw Sam Jethro play over there. You know, I was asking them, what kind of reaction did Sam Jethro get?
And he was the Rookie of the Year in 1950. That's why Bill brings him up.
And they played a mile down the road from Fenway Park. So I was wondering, is this because Boston fans couldn't stomach a black athlete? No, he was incredibly popular. He was one of the most popular 3 or 4 players on the team. So it wasn't that. And I went to South Carolina. I visited people that worked for Mr. Yawkey when he was still, 40 years earlier. They were in their 20s. Now they're in their 60s. And trying to get any information I could. And his best friend was a mixed-race person, they called him, down there in South Carolina. He was an employee. And so I was talking to his son, and I said, okay, yeah, maybe they were friends, but there's also the boss and employee. And he said, well, it didn't feel like that. He said, Mr. Yawkey'd come over to our house and sit down and have breakfast, and then they'd go out and do their thing. Or he'd go over to Mr. Yawkey's house and have breakfast over there. He felt like part of the family, and we felt like part of the family too. So it's very confusing to try to figure it out. Talk to different ball players that were on the Red Sox, like Reggie Smith or so forth, and most of them have good things to say about their interest.
Reggie loved him, for crying out loud, in 1967. He loved him, Billy, no?
Yeah, he just spoke out in the last few days. Dan Shaughnessy just did an interview with him for the Boston Globe, and he spoke out and he said he doesn't want to see the street name changed.
Which tells you what you need to know. Now, from a standpoint, you indicate here that it's the people that he hired, whether they be Cronin, who ran the team for a while. Collins died, so Cronin runs the team. Picky Huggins becomes the manager. And at least in a couple of cases, he had racists working for him who were in a position of authority to bring in black players. And for whatever the reason, they didn't because they were bigoted, and Yawkey did not do anything about it because he was their drinking partner. So how much culpability do we give Yawkey for that? Let me hear your take there.
Well, you really have to blame him for it because he owned the team. I think he, at a personal level, he liked these guys. They were former ball players in the case of Pinky Higgins, which is kind of an amusing name to give a guy that's a white racist. But he was a good ball player when he was a ball player, and Yawkey just trusted him. He trusted a lot of people that probably abused his trust, that weren't good executives, that weren't good managers, but were pals with Yawkey, and he valued that kind of friendship, and to the detriment of the business side of his operation, I think.
Yes. Now, how about the quote to Robinson when he came for the tryout in 45? And Robinson, really hurt Yawkey for a lot of years. Had a lot to say about Yawkey. And, listen, nobody can argue with him. He had a lot to say. Racist. You just mentioned the 67 World Series. But every time Robinson had a chance to knock Yawkey, he did. He blames it a lot on that tryout in 45. Give him a little rundown there, Billy. What can you tell him?
Yeah, we were coming out of World War II. No team had integrated at the time, but African Americans were serving in the armed forces in the Pacific and European theaters. They were risking their lives at war, and the armed forces began to integrate. Looking back on it now, we can see that baseball was one of the industries that took the lead in America, way before, say, banking or newspapers or whatever. It was baseball that took the lead, with Jackie Robinson coming into the major leagues in 1947. The Red Sox were under political pressure in the Boston area just as the war was ending, and in April 1945, one of the city councilors, Isidore Muchnick was his name, he said that the Red Sox were going to take away their license to play baseball on Sunday, which they needed under arcane laws of the day, if they don't give a fair tryout to a black ball player. So they gave a tryout, but it wasn't really a fair tryout. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. They had Jackie Robinson and Sam Jethro and a third guy named Marvin Williams. The three of them came in April 45 and had a tryout at the park, at Fenway Park, and the Red Sox then said, thanks, talk to you later. And they never even sent him a thank you note for coming by. They certainly didn't hire any of the three of them, and yet two of them later became Rookie of the Year, Robinson and Jethro, both of them.
Right, and then, of course, bad language to Robinson. What can you tell him about that story? Go ahead.
Well, that's not altogether clear what happened. One reporter, Cliff Keene, said that he heard the N-word shouted out during the tryout, and he said it came from the area of the executive offices. At that time, there weren't very many people that could have been in the executive offices because it was a pretty small staff. It doesn't have to be somebody. It could have been a janitor. I mean, I don't really know, and it might not have even happened. It's not on tape or anything. Only one guy claims to have ever really heard it. And I asked a number of reporters that knew Cliff Keene, and they kind of said he was a really good reporter, but allowed that maybe he might have made up something like that too. It's really it's hard to pin down. Boston was certainly not welcoming. There were no black employees at any level in the ball club, not even ushers until well into the late 60s, early 70s even. Yeah,
so we have to blame Yawkey for being, just not being proactive enough. I mean, the Yankees took forever too, 1955. Right. But, I don't know if it makes a difference. They won all those championships, so I guess the Yankees get a pass. You tell me. But, 1959, I believe the last team prior to that was like 57. So,
yeah, I think it was 57. The Phillies, I think, were the next to the last.
I mean, that's 2 years. I mean, how in the world? I mean, if Yawkey, who spends all this money on Jimmy Fund and the greatest philanthropist of all time, he's got these schools for the disenfranchised kid. I mean, the players love him. He's the nicest guy in the world. How do you have this blemish? And how do you examine it? It's very. I mean, he takes the responsibility. It's his fault. He hired Pinky Huggins and Cronin. He hired the guys, so he's got to take the blame. But it's very peculiar considering the fact that Yawkey in all other walks of life hit a home run. Yet in this one he did not. I can't figure it out.
He had a school for a residential school for kids that had horrible family situations in South Carolina that had started in the even before that, and from the beginning. Even in South Carolina, they refused to have racial distinctions down there. So it's just weird with the ball.
So he had black kids. He had black kids go to the school in South Carolina. You didn't have a black player on the Red Sox. That's the strangest thing in the world, for crying out loud.
It really is. You think, looking back on it now, if he knew we would be talking 40 years after he died about. He never put his name on anything when he was alive. He wouldn't allow his name to be put on a building or a hospital or anything like that. But if he knew there was this discussion about taking his name off, he would have done something about it. But at the time, he didn't, and he knew he was the last team. How could you not know that? He was on American League committees where they discussed the issue of race back even in the 30s. They were discussing it. You could see from the minutes of the meetings. He just never really said anything on the subject. Some of the other owners, like Griffith from Washington, he used the N-word himself in the minutes of some of the American League meetings. But Yawkey never really commented on it, and yet when it came right down to it, he never. They had Earl Wilson, I guess, that was ready to come up in '57, but he ended up in the military service for 2 years.
So Wilson could have beaten Pumpsy Green. Now, I don't know if Pumpsy Green has probably passed away.
No.
Oh, he's alive.
He's still living out in California.
All right. Did you talk to Pumpsy Green? What was Pumpsy Green's reaction when he became the first Black Red Sox in 1959?
Yeah, well, Pumpsy Green, I spent a lot of time with him. I even wrote a book on him called Pumpsy and Progress. So I spent a lot of time talking to him, and he was just thrilled to have a job. His dream was to play Major League Baseball. He knew he wasn't the greatest player in the world, but he lived out his dream, and he made it. He didn't want to be any symbol of integration. He wanted to be considered a ball player, not a black ball player. So he pretty much kept to himself too. But he said when he came to the Red Sox in '59, Mr. Yawkey invited him up to the office all by himself. Invited him up, said he's welcome to the Boston Red Sox. If there's anything I can ever do to help you, let me know. I own the club. The buck stops here. And he said he felt very welcomed. Now, this, as we are discussing, this is 12 years after Jackie Robinson. It would have been nice if a few other players had been welcomed earlier, but when he finally got there, he felt welcomed. And
Earl Wilson felt the same way, and Reggie Smith, Boomer Scott, these guys all felt the same way when they came to the Red Sox in the 60s?
Yep. Anyone that you talked to, they pretty much did. Now, there are some of them, like Tommy Harper.
Well, he's all over it right now. Harper's mad. I get that. Go ahead.
Yeah, he got fired twice by the Red Sox, and he's with them now as a consultant. But he's had a sort of stormy history with the Red Sox, and he takes the approach that is very understandable that, there was institutional racism in the Red Sox. Maybe it wasn't Yawkey. Maybe he trusted people that were racist, but Yawkey has to bear responsibility for allowing this situation to happen.
Right. It's very difficult. I'm going to take the Yawkey side because of all the great things he did, and the fact that every player on the Red Sox after Pumpsy Green, including Green, loved him. He was fair to him and all those things. We all know about the tremendous philanthropy. He's in the Hall of Fame. Williams showed up, but it's a very tricky call. So I'm going to ask you: do you have a major problem if they change the name from Yawkey Way to Jersey Street? Do you want to leave it alone? What's your take on it?
I'm a little agnostic on the subject. I wouldn't like to see Yawkey get blamed for being a personal racist if he wasn't, but he did allow this situation to happen that we're still talking about more than 50 years later. Now, the question about changing to Jersey Street, I saw somebody wrote an article for the paper that said, "Who's Jersey?" And then they found this guy that is the Earl of Jersey from England, they think it's named after, again, there's sort of no smoking gun, but they said this guy, it looks like he might have made some of his money on the slave trade.
And they name it after him. See, there's never an end with this thing. That's the
right.
It's going to be changed. I know it's I don't know, maybe the Red Sox fan could care less now, but he is in the Hall of Fame. What would you recommend? What's your take on it?
About changing the street name?
Well, you did this. You wrote this exhaustive study, this great book. I'm going to argue that the name should not be changed. And I know in the 50s I got problems too, but I'm going to argue that it's not going to be changed. To me, it's about Henry being politically correct. What does Bill Nowlin think?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't mind being politically correct myself. I'd be happy to see. I am happy to see Confederate general statues come down throughout the South and so forth. But I don't know. My inclination, maybe because I spent so much time learning about Tom Yawkey, my inclination would be to want to keep it the same too. But it wouldn't, if they ended up changing it, it's not the end of my world. I think having it Yawkey, it allows more of a chance to educate people and to talk about this issue maybe. Then once it changes, everybody forgets about it.
That's a good point. Now, let's do this, then we'll take a break and do the other stuff with the teams. How much money, in your estimation, has Tom Yawkey donated to good causes? Give him a figure.
$500 million.
So
the rest of it in a trust. I mean, when they sold the team, they got $700 million, and that money can be used for nothing other than charity eventually.
So this is a guy who spent $500 billion now.
$500 million.
$500 million. I'm sorry, $500 million.
But by the time it's all over, it'll be $1 billion.
$1 billion. Let's say $1 billion on everything from the Jimmy Fund to the schools in South Carolina, to hospital wings, to everything known to man. $500 million. I mean, when does the good outweigh the bad? Let's ask it that way.
Well, that's it. And just on the race question alone, to end before your break. A woman wrote into the newspaper here and said maybe Yawkey was a racist in the 40s and the 50s, maybe. But by the 60s and 70s, he clearly wasn't. So should you give a guy a chance to evolve and maybe give somebody credit for growing in their life?
Yeah, that is fair too. And he's before we take a break, tell me Yastrzemski's story. This gives you another look at Yawkey. Tell me Yastrzemski's story about his wife in his 75 World Series, about his mother in his 75 World Series.
Yeah,
go ahead.
He was Yawkey was dying himself of cancer. It wasn't well known. It was in fact quite secret. But Yaz's mother also was very ill. And so Yawkey had box seats. Of course, he owned the ballpark. He could have any seat he wanted. But he would normally have sat for the World Series, sat down close to the game. He gave up his seat so that Carl Yastrzemski's mother could have a better and more private seat down front, and he went up onto the roof.
And then in St. Louis, he watched the game in the trainer's room, didn't he not? The 3 or 4 games in St. Louis?
That part I don't remember.
I thought he watched one of the games. You mentioned that he watched one of the games with the Red Sox game, so Yaz's mom could sit in the stands, and he watched the game in the trainer's room.
Yep.
I mean, think about that for a second. And now tell him about the no-hitters. When every pitcher came off the field after he pitched a no-hitter. Give him that story for a second.
Well, he'd give them he'd tear up their contract. You weren't allowed to give somebody a bonus, but what he'd do is he'd tear up their contract and say, I'm giving you a new contract, and the new contract would be for somewhat more money. In those days, $1,000 was a lot of money for a ball player.
So if you pitched a no-hitter, you walked off the field, you met him after the game, he gave you a new contract with an extra $1,000 in it.
Right.
And how about the player who got sent down to the minor leagues who had to have his money cut in half, and he said no to that? Give him that story for a second.
Yeah, there were plenty of players like that for one reason or another, they were asked to put more time in the minor leagues, but he allowed them to keep their major league salary. He never tried to cut off a player's livelihood or salary, and usually when they first came to the team, he told them, listen, we want you to be welcome here. If you need to borrow some money to put down a mortgage on a house, we'll loan you the money, no interest.
Yeah, and he also saw him washing the players' cars, for crying out loud. This is
yeah, there's 2 or 3 stories like that about one ball player. He'd driven up. He'd just arrived at the Red Sox, so his car was all dirty. He drove it into the park, which you can still do actually. And he was washing his car, and this old man came over and started helping him wash the car. And they were just chatting for 20 minutes or so, and then the guy walked off, and somebody else came over and said, you know who that was? And he said, no, he's just some old guy. And he said, no, that was Tom Yawkey. He owns the team.
Yeah, how about that? We'll come back and do 67 and 75 with Bill Nowlin on Tom Yawkey. Stick with us.